Howdy and welcome back. I started a video and then realized my microphone was far away. So let me try this again. Our last video for the first week of class. And we were talking about the risk categories, the characteristics of risk, all these complexity. And, in a way, it's kind of exciting, all these wonderful ways to think of this problem. And then it's also kind of like, it's a little overwhelming. When we talk about how hard is it to quantify strategic and operational risk? Quantify means we can't put numbers to it. I talk a lot about qualitative risk as well. For instance, in cybersecurity, when we talk about the criticality of data, we say, is it low, medium, or high? It doesn't matter to say it's 90% critical, it's 95% critical, it's 60% critical. We just say, is it low? For instance, everybody knows my name. That's low criticality of the data. Medium would be perhaps where I teach and when I teach at A&M. High would obviously be a student's grades and health history and financial records. So when we talk about the inability to quantify, a lot of times we fall back on the qualitative notion. Now here's the problem with that. When we talk about probabilities, when we talk about a lot of these models, they want numbers. They can't deal with high, medium, low. What does that mean? So we've got a lot of data, and we've never had a loss of data. We've always had a lot of data. But so much of that data is very focused. We know how many customers we sold last week. We know how many people came into our enterprise. We know how many people bought the green t-shirts but didn't buy the pink hats. We know all this kind of information because that's easy to capture. But when we talk about operational risk, we're talking about how the company operates. Are we talking about looking at the processes, the timing of the processes? Is that really what we want to capture? Or when we talk about strategic risk, how do we quantify? How do we put a number to a possible new market or a possible new product or something that could happen that's a crisis in one part of the world that could affect us? And that's tough to quantify. So we talk a lot, and another trend you will see, and I'm a big person on emerging trends. Look at what the trends are. This class is a trend. We're on the tipping point or the tip of the sword kind of thing of trying to figure out enterprise risk because it's an emerging issue in business and in government and anything that tries to operate as an enterprise. There used to be a saying in technology, when you're on the cutting edge, be sure you're on the right side of the blade, right? Because a lot of the ones that will pioneer will be the ones that fail. Well, traditionally, enterprise risk management worried about the dollars. This company, again, capitalistic country, we run on profit, we got to worry about money, but then here's the problem with that. One, we've difficult to quantify, but also how do we talk about financial risk in one term, one measurement, dollars, and then in strategic and operational risk in another? So I put here that this is a myth regarding the importance of financial risk. Perhaps myth isn't the right word, but what I'm trying to say is if you rely too much at looking at the dollars and the numbers, again, there's books and books and books about companies that did that. So let me give you an example. In the last lecture, I mentioned Osborne Computer. Osborne Computer basically invented the portable computer. Now, it wasn't portable by today's standards. It was a big, honking piece of equipment, 20, 30 pounds. I can't remember. It was huge compared to what we have, right? Osborne sold like hotcakes. Everybody wanted one, even though you dislocated your shoulder moving this baby around. Everybody wanted an Osborne computer, the Osborne 1. And Mr. Osborne was a smart guy, very good technically, wrote books. People read the Osborne books for technology and the like. And he announced the Osborne 2. And it was going to be better. It's going to be lighter. It's going to be faster. And, lighter is a relative term. Well, the Osborne 2 never shipped, and that's because Osborne went bankrupt. Because what happened is all the orders for Osborne 1 that they were counting on for the cash flow were canceled in preference to waiting for Osborne 2. That is the best example I have in my toolkit of case studies for understanding the importance of financial risk when it's tied to strategy. The strategy would have been to make sure you have enough money in the bank for the Osborne 2, or maybe offer some kind of upgrade or something. But there were so many orders canceled that the company did not survive. So while it's easy to count the money, the dollars and the cents, we need to look at that again when we talk about the holistic risk management of talking about that with our other two big ones, strategic and operational. So it's we can't think of every possible risk, and like I said before, there's some risk that we can't worry about. Um, uh, we don't want to overwhelm to where we're collecting so much data and doing so much data analytics. We've got the old paralysis through analysis. So we targeted like 30 key risks here. That's what we're hoping our ontology will show us. And by the way, at my next lecture, I'm working on some slides now to better get some graphics for ontology. My problem is I'm not a very good visual person, but basically, what are the foundation of decision making within the company? And also remember this, emerging. What is emerging as a risk? If you're in the financial area, if you keep personal identifiable information, you look at what's happening in Europe when they passed General Data Protection Regulation May of 2018, GDPR, an emerging trend that you're going to have to take into account is other countries' legislation that uses what we call extraterritorial jurisdiction to reach into United States businesses, United States-based businesses, and that's a risk. It's a compliance risk. It's a legal risk. It could be a cyber risk because of the nature of the law that was passed with draconian penalties for violating the law. So Sim Siegel's the only person, I looked through several trying to books, and even that this book is kind of old, but he was the only one that we could find that talked about the myth of the financial risk, confusing the source of the risk with its outcome, or confusing what you think about the risk. Remember, risk, every time you hear the word risk, what are you going to think about? Impact, synonymous for outcome. And also, because companies that are publicly traded by federal law and the SEC are required to submit periodic financial statements, this is another reason why we look at the financials, and here's the problem with that. The financials give us one metric, one viewpoint, an aspect, yes, an important aspect. Company can't stay in business long, or an enterprise, if it's losing money, if it doesn't have cash on hand. However, you have to be careful of the blinders, that you get overly focused on that. So this is just a think question for you. If we say, hey, here's the 30 risks we're going to look at, what are some issues for you as risk manager? Maybe some of these, there's other risks that pertain to your business we haven't put on that list. Maybe we don't understand the emerging trends in your business. One size does not fit all. This is not a generic answer. So again, this is a thinking analysis type of course. So what I tell you, this is one course where I don't want to use the legal terms. Somebody asks you a question, it depends. But this is a course where we don't have the answers. We really don't have the answers because they don't yet exist. We're trying to formulate the strategy. Another key risk focus is the size of the company. We tend to think the bigger it is, the harder it'll fall kind of thing. This doesn't matter. In some ways, the small company and the large company are kind of equal and how their risk will affect them. Now, the impacts are going to be different. You have a billion-dollar company that has a risk and goes out of business, or you have a company that does $50 million a year. Okay, the impact's going to be different. But we want to be careful assuming that there's, a big company's got all these more risk. No, we got to look at the small and medium enterprises. And here's a couple of reasons why. One is they're kind of equal to a big company in the risk assessment. The other is the cascading effect of those small and medium companies if they're in the supplier chain of the larger enterprise. So their risks are not any less, smaller list, less of an impact. In some ways, they could have a bigger impact because they could actually cause a risk to a larger enterprise, and the larger enterprise has to account for that. One of the risks they'll have is in their supplier chain. So this is just kind of saying the same thing. at the end of the day, the companies all have the same kind of pyramid scheme. The CEO in a small business might also be the guy who heads the board of directors if it's publicly owned, or he may be the senior manager. I've had small businesses. We started one once. We thought we were going to have 8 employees. It grew to 15. It grew to 25. It grew to 40. One day I woke up and I had like 90 people on the payroll, right? At the same time, there were the same 2 or 3 owners in the beginning were running the business. The pyramid was getting wider, not taller. Another problem we have is risk management programs that deal with one aspect. So it's kind of like put your goggles on. I'm an HR person, so I see everything as people risk. I myself, I'm a technology person. How many of my examples have been from technology companies, right? I see it as an IT risk or I see it as a cyber risk. We have to be careful of this. We have to be able to look at the different viewpoints. We have to be able to look at the organization, the enterprise goals, the products, where it all feeds into that. The HR, yeah, important component. IT, yeah, important component. The manufacturing, yeah, important component. But because of our background, we have to be careful not to let that put our blinders on when we look at the totality of the problem. So again, when we talk about different risk types, there's this interdependence we're trying to work out. There's these relationships. There's bad things can happen. Another example, Volkswagen. Volkswagen had a systematic problem within their company, and this really disappoints me as a former software engineer. They put in software code to circumvent accurately and honestly reporting emissions data. Now, somewhere along the line, this just isn't one person. There's a few key people who have gone to prison over this. Volkswagen, but there had to be a team of people. There had to be developers in this. There had to be people who were testing the software. There was more. This wasn't just one bad actor in Volkswagen. This was many bad actors in Volkswagen. At the end of the day, the CEO, the higher ups are the one that are going to pay. But my point is, there's this real world complexity, and look what they did. They altered the software to say that their emissions were within acceptable legislative statutory constraints. Small-term impact, I read one study that says it causes 8 more people in the United Kingdom or in Britain to die of cancer. Well, 8 people doesn't sound like much. Look at it from Volkswagen's perspective. They knowingly lied, they misled. Some of them went to prison. They are being fined. Every city and state in the United States is suing them. City of Houston suing them. Their reputation, when I think of Volkswagen now, I think fraud. I don't think those cute little Beetles I drove when I was in college. And so we have to be also careful that something like that, which, there needs to be a book written on this or something. Was this a strategy that came from the CEO? Was this the head of engineering that was under, constraints and wanted to have his performance within what was considered acceptable by the company? I don't know. But the lesson for all of us is you can't just look at anything in isolation. A bad group of engineers and software programmers made some very bad, illegal decisions, and it affected the enterprise. And it's inefficient because, if you're not looking at that in the totality, you might be focusing on a risk and trying to fix that. And on the enterprise level, it's not having the effect that you wanted. That's the overpaying. Or an under-communicating will be, did this software sector that was developing this, was this being communicated to other sectors? Did the PR know about it? Did the legal know about it? Hopefully not, because if so, there ought to be a number of lawyers being disbarred. They made a bad business decision. They made an illegal business decision. There's no arguing about that at Volkswagen. At the same time, how was it isolated and not communicated outside? Now, obviously, people aren't going to say, "Hey, I'm lying in my software code," right? But at the same time, as I said before, this isn't a couple of people. You've got a software designer, you've got the coders, you've got the testers, you've got the validators. You have a ton of people who knew or should have known. And by the way, those are becoming very important legal terms now. It used to be, did you know? Now it's, did you know or should have known? Was it within your job purview to know this was going on? So it's just a bad thing. It's bad all the way around. You can't defend this whole silo approach where I'm going to run my section in isolation. You're part of the enterprise. That section is part of the enterprise and contributes to that risk. But here's the problem that we have again. We try to aggravate, not aggravate, that's a Freudian slip, aggregate a metric. We want to have an overall metric. We want somebody to just tell us, because otherwise we're looking at this vast, complex network of enterprise risk factors. And we want to say, just tell me, what's is it a 5? Is it a 10? Is it a 15? What does that mean? What does that mean for your risk factors? So we try to target and we try to understand how that fits. But because we're going to look at it as the strategic, the financially operational, and all the underlying risk, it's really hard to come up with a set of metrics that accurately produce what we need to know to make good business decisions. So we can calculate metrics. We can give you all the numbers we want. We can carry them out to as many decimal points as you want. But you know what? If it's bad data, garbage in, garbage out, it's not going to tell you what you need. And so part of this class is to investigate, because people will bring technologies to you and say, hey, we have all this data. Let's take all this data. If we analyze it and process it, store it, visualize it, we're going to get the answers. And you have to be able to say, wait a minute, is this technology applicable here? Where's this data coming from? Is the data valid? How did you set this analysis up? If you're not aware of it, right now there's a big issue in algorithm development. There's a book called Algorithms of Oppression. It started out that machine learning, and we'll talk about this when we talk about machine learning, uses data to train. So it started out, it used bad test data. So quite frankly, if you were going to build a market segment or predict people being in a hospital or something like that, and you don't accurately define your data sets, then the system's going to train on invalid data. So for instance, in HR, they trained systems and they found they were inherently biased against women and those from underrepresented groups, because they had trained that on data, but primarily white males, because that was the data that was available. Okay, computers can't do magic. You have to tell them what to do. You have to set something up. They can't invent this. Yesterday or today, I just read on the news where now there is a algorithm that has been found to be used in medical care that prioritizes patient triaging in the wrong order. Again, it's a technical issue. Okay, my point is we want metrics, we want to make it easy, we want to have numbers as managers to look at. From a technical viewpoint, you need to know which questions to ask about where that data comes from. And then it's more about than just risk reporting. Okay, I'm going to give you my risk. I'm going to tell you, bye, see you in 6 months. It's a continuous monitoring. Something may change tonight. I may go home tonight, get up tomorrow, pick up my Wall Street Journal or New York Times or one of my many blogs I read and say, oh my gosh, everything I thought got changed because fill in an event. Okay? So first of all, it has to be continuing risk assessment and managing. And then once you've analyzed and found the risk, guess what? When you mitigate or use one of your 4 strategies, the dynamics change, and you're constantly having to go back to see how the risk changed. So mitigation is very interesting. It's running the business, it's being compliant, it's looking for opportunities, and it's doing this in a dynamic environment. No, we don't have the luxury of even saying, hey, come for the next 24 hours, nothing changes so I can kind of get a handle on what I'm going. No, we put in trades or tariffs as a government policy, and it affects our business. There's a court decision that comes down. Court decisions come down every day. I try to keep monitoring on them. Some of them are binding, some are what we call persuasive. They might not be in our appellate district in the U.S., but they may be something that our appellate district says, they got it right, and we're going to incorporate that. And then when we disclose it, how do we disclose it so it makes sense? How do we disclose it so stakeholders can make intelligent decisions? The SEC material rule for publicly traded companies says that we have to disclose a risk that could be of material to making a decision whether to invest in the company. Well, okay, so there's very clever art sometimes to presenting data that no one seems to really understand the content or the meaning of, right? But as it says here, improperly disclosing risk can have huge implications. The SEC can come after you, the FTC can come after you, government regulators can come after you, the media can come after you. And this all leads to risk. It's an important component of how we value companies. How can they manage risk? Look at Apple. How many times has Apple been on the ropes that it could have gone bankrupt? Dell Computer came within one summer of going bankrupt. I think in the early 80s or something, one man gave up a trip to Europe to put the company um, back on keel because they said it's not going to last. Every company at some point risks completely going bankrupt or under. They are having to reinvent themselves. This isn't just a PR or marketing. This is going back and looking at the risk. IBM still survives after 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They constantly reinvent themselves, but they're not just. It's not a PR. It's not like, okay, today we're going to call ourselves this. It's part of their strategy. It's part of understanding their risk. It's part of, they got rid of their laptop business when it became a commodity. They sold it to a Chinese company. So all this goes to the underlying thing that we are a capitalist country. Companies need to have value because they need to make money for their shareholders. They need to treat their stakeholders correctly, and they need to be profitable. So shareholders is the primary stakeholder, but by no means are they the only stakeholder. Okay, we have regulators, we have the general public. A controversy I got into a few years ago at another university, we were talking about who the customers were of that university, and people said the students. And I said, no, the students are stakeholders. They benefit from what we're doing, but the ultimate customer is the state of Texas, who funds a large part of that public university, but also the public at large and the industry that we're creating future workforce for. But we are not going to tailor what we do to the students as the customers. They are stakeholders, but they are not who ultimately will consume what we're producing. It's the kind of way I looked at it. That's going to end that. Thank you for staying with me. Be back with you soon.